All right, we're back again with another foundational documents video. So this time we're going to be doing Federalist 10. This is the fourth installment in your foundational documents video series. So, document snapshot. James Madison's defense of the Republican form of government proposed by the Constitution. A lot of anti-federalists were arguing for a more direct democracy form of government, or at the very least, kind of that decentralized federal government that they enjoyed under the Articles of Confederation. They didn't want to have a government that was too large or unresponsive to the people. So this is Madison's defense of those ideas or those arguments that were floating around and being proposed by the Anti-Federalists during this time. Madison explores and goes into great depth with majority rule versus minority rights in this essay. He countered that it was exactly the great number of factions and diversity that would avoid tyranny. So the fact that we had a lot of different groups and that the country was relatively large would force negotiation and compromise, and that negotiation and compromise would be reflective of majority ideals, but would respect the rights of minorities. Further, he argued that the large size of the country would actually make it more difficult for factions to form, which is something that Brutus I will address, which we'll get to in a later video. So, step one, his definition of faction. A number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority, so you can have either one, of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, so interest groups, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So the key with a faction is that their ideas are dependent on benefiting them and their faction and not other citizens or the interests of the community at large. Okay. Madison goes on to say that there are two methods of curing the mischiefs of factions: removing the causes or controlling the effects. Okay. And this is where he spends a good portion of the beginning of the essay, is discussing these two options. Removing causes doesn't make a whole lot of sense to Madison. You can limit people's freedoms to form factions and associate with one another. That's one of the ways that you get rid of factions, is you limit people's freedoms. Okay. This is worse than factions in Madison's argument. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire. If we want to stop fire and stop anyone from getting burned, we can get rid of air, but then we die. Okay. If we want to stop factions from forming, we can get rid of freedoms, but then what's the point? Okay, you're getting rid of the thing for which people are forming the government in the first place. Okay, give every citizen the same opinions, the same passions, and the same interest. That's another option for removing the causes. Is you can't have factions if everybody thinks the same thing. That is brainwashing. Okay, and it once again limits your rights. Okay, Madison goes on to basically say, if you're wrong, you have the right to be wrong, and the government should not be brainwashing you into thinking one way. Okay, or the other. So generally speaking, he gets rid of that idea of removing causes. Again, that's kind of a joke there. You can't have factions if you don't have freedoms. But that's basically Madison's point, is we have to preserve freedoms. So you have to allow factions to exist. And that's where he transitions to his next point, which is, rather than trying to remove the causes of factions, control the effects of factions. Okay. Minority factions are controlled through the Republican principle, regular elections. Okay, controlling majority factions is a little trickier, so that's what we're going to get into next. Just to go back to that minority factions idea, a minority faction is not a threat to the country or to the general populace of the country, because by their very nature, as a minority faction, they cannot assume control. They can't gain control of the legislature or of the White House. They might gain control of a branch or one of the two houses, okay, in Congress, but they're not going to gain control of the entire federal government. A minority faction it's not powerful enough. Okay, so regular elections control minority factions. Majority factions. Madison painstakingly walks the reader through how majority factions can be controlled by a Republican form of government, which is what the Constitution's proposing, that you vote and I vote for people who then go and enact policy on our behalf. As opposed to a true democracy, a direct democracy in which we would be making policy and voting on initiatives ourselves. Okay, Ideas and factions will be controlled because topics will be debated by a small number of citizens elected by the rest. So that's one of the things that majority factions allow us. Ideas and factions will be controlled because the large size and diverse nature of citizens will prevent any one faction from dominating the government, okay, which we'll go back to towards the end of the video. This is a funny little meme here. American creates political factions. James Madison, you weren't supposed to do that. It's not actually what Madison said. Madison said that factions are inevitable. And rather than going into it blindly and allowing the republic to be destroyed by this idea of oh no, factions are existing, we weren't counting on that, know that they're going to exist no matter what, and now control the effects, okay? Are political parties factions? Yes and no. Technically, they meet Madison's definition, but you have to recognize that modern political parties are often made up of smaller factions that are working together to actualize or bring about some general set of policy standards, a platform, for instance, that individually they'd be powerless to enact on their own. And you can pick either party, it doesn't matter which, okay? But even on certain wedge issues, political parties are not in lockstep with one another. There are Democrats who are pro-life, okay? There are Republicans who are pro-choice. But in general, to enact policy that aligns more with their individual ideology, they're willing to sacrifice in order to bring about policy that they think would be beneficial. Okay, so factions and political parties are not interchangeable, but you can absolutely use those general ideas and what Madison thinks about why factions are bad to discuss why political parties are bad as too. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. Real quick, a quote. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through other states. Generally speaking, this is basically making the argument that that factions allow for a maybe not so great politician or political ideology to seize control of a state or of a local government or maybe a small collection of states. But the likelihood of that leading to mass chaos or the takeover of the federal government by this dangerous faction is minimal. The country's too large, the people are too diverse, and it's just not a real threat. According to Madison at the time. You can make an argument that based on, the rise of, technology and the way that we can share ideas through social media and different things like that, that maybe it is a threat for a factious leader to kind of gain control nationally or a faction to gain control nationally. But generally speaking, Madison's argument is the country's too big, the country's too diverse, or will be too big or too diverse in the future, and therefore factions will be localized and we don't have any real threat to the national government. Okay. How could I see this document being used? My best guess, anything dealing with factions or majority versus minority rights, problems of political parties. You can bring in Fed 10 as an argument that political parties maybe have some not so great consequences for our Republican form of government. The importance of regular elections to control those minority factions, and interest groups as competing vehicles of factions. Those ideas that citizens are getting together with like-minded citizens to actualize, to bring about a certain set of policy standards around a particular ideology or policy. That is another way that this could show up. Okay, is that interest group argument. So can you think of any more potential uses of the document? Fed 10 is super important because it deals with elections. It deals with the way that majority versus minority parties and groups deal with one another. So it could show up on your argumentative essay. All right. Best of luck.